This video is sponsored by Delete Me. Viewer discretion is advised. There's a mission in Grand Theft Auto 5 where you torture an innocent man for information on a hit. From the start, he's willing to tell you everything you need to know, but FIB agent Steve Haynes insists on torturing him. Why not? You hook your victim up to a heart monitor and get to work pulling teeth, breaking limbs, even waterboarding him with gasoline. It's not a challenging mission, but it's intimate. He tries to give you the information you need. He pleads, he begs, he promises to talk, but you ignore him. Trevor doesn't care. The beeps from the heart machine accelerate. I felt my stomach drop as I broke him. It's a surprisingly delicate process, and if you do too much, the man will go into cardiac arrest. You can revive him 3 times with an adrenaline shot. As a high schooler, this was too much. I've never finished this mission or the game. I felt guilty. To some of you, this may sound ridiculous, even weak. It's just a game, designed for my entertainment. As I've gotten older, I've felt less guilty about scenes like this, but I still hesitate to be evil. I still feel bad when I mistakenly pick the mean dialogue option. Why do I care so much? These aren't real people. And yet it seems like I forget that sometimes. Or maybe what I feel doesn't depend on what I know. How can I feel guilty in the first place if I know it's just a game? It's only recently that I figured it out. This is what's known as the paradox of fiction, a problem that has puzzled philosophers since it was proposed in 1975. It's a complicated issue. We're going to have to unpack it in stages. But let me give you half of the answer up front. Guilt starts with empathy. I don't mean sympathy or compassion. There's a lot of debate about its definition, but for our purposes, empathy is the ability to understand and share the emotions of others. We can't really feel guilty for something we did if we don't understand its impact on others. In psychology, empathy is treated as having 2 different sides. Cognitive empathy is the ability to understand what someone is feeling and why. Affective empathy is the ability to share that feeling. Red Dead Redemption 2 is the best example I know of for both in a game. You came here to understand guilt in video games. First, we need to explore its relationship with empathy. But by the end of this video, you're going to see guilt in a completely new way. This video tries very hard not to spoil the main story of Red Dead Redemption 2. It spoils one side quest from Cyberpunk 2077, an Act 1 scene for the Dark Urge in Baldur's Gate 3, and most of Spec Ops The Line. Games sometimes have interesting ways of showing how evil the player is. In Fallout 3, there's the karma system, which feels like an afterthought. One of the most evil things you can do is detonate the nuke in Megaton. And you never really get punished for it. Your dad's reaction is,
"There's too much work to be done now to let this get in the way."
If you kill too many animals and don't starve, a monster named Krampus spawns and steals your items. In Metal Gear Solid 5, the piece of shrapnel permanently housed in Venom Snake's skull grows into a demon's horn the more violent you are. Constructing a nuke makes it happen instantly and permanently covers him in blood. The scars on Shepard's face deepen and widen the more aggressive he is in Mass Effect 2. His body was only mostly reconstructed after a deep space disaster that should have killed him, and the aggression is tearing his body apart at the seams. These examples all have one thing in common, though. They're minor, inconsequential parts of the games they're in. They don't really make me feel guilty. The same can't be said for Red Dead Redemption 2. You wouldn't expect it, least of all from a Rockstar game, but the game's honor system is its most important mechanic. If you could only take away one idea from Red Dead Redemption 2, it'd be that you can never escape your sins. Arthur's world feels desperate and sad. The Wild West is no longer wild. His world is changing. The Vanderlyn gang is being hunted by a private army, and they seem to be doing everything except lying low. The greatest man he's ever known is making decisions that he struggles to understand. Arthur is loyal. His family is everything he fights for, but he knows they can't return to the world they once knew. The frontier is changing. Maybe he should change too.
They don't want folk like us no more. We're being hunted.
Red Dead Redemption 2 is about guilt, and it uses empathy to get you to share Arthur's remorse. In her doctoral thesis on the problem of empathy, the philosopher Edith Stein claims that empathy is how the inner lives of other people are revealed to us. Her dissertation was written at a time when one of the greatest philosophical problems was escaping solipsism. That's the idea other people might not exist. The current theories had some trouble proving the existence of others, but Stein pointed out that any writing on solipsism at least acknowledges that we experience other people in the world. Empathy is her name for that encounter. She tried to find its source in the bodily expression of others. She thought we can immediately understand what another person is feeling by looking at them. For her, basic empathy is largely intuitive. I don't need to take signs that someone's feeling cold, shivering, goosebumps, and so on, and cross-reference those things in my head to infer, oh, that person is cold because I do that when I'm cold. That kind of approach lacks something human about it. We never have to think about these things. We simply know. We see happiness in another's smile. We see sadness in their tears. You see Arthur's guilt physically erupt out of him as he retrieves debts from people. One of these people is a Polish immigrant. Arthur is brutal. You throw the man to the ground. You beat him. He scuttles away from you on the floor. His screams are in a language you don't understand. You're getting nowhere at this rate. You search the back 2 rooms for something of value. Nothing. Every container is empty. The man's cries echo in the background. I tore him away from the table he was protecting and took the wedding ring in the drawer. Arthur is a likable character. I did not like him during this scene. It was deeply uncomfortable, like seeing your friend's dad lose his temper. You've seen Arthur violent before, but not like this. This was unnecessary. But in this uncharacteristic rage, I could sense his own conflicted feelings. His lack of hope. His guilt. At night, haunting melodies echoed throughout arid landscapes, as if my dark deeds prowled amongst the shadows at the edge of my campfire. The end of every day is a time for reflection. Stein's book is mostly about cognitive empathy. On the subject of affective empathy, Stein explains that we never literally experience another's pain firsthand. I can feel what they're feeling alongside them, but empathy never unites 2 separate consciousnesses. Red Dead applies this fact in a special way. The game does a very good job at giving you the feeling of never escaping the law. Bounty hunters lurked just out of sight for most of my time in New Hanover. They would sneak up to my campsites while I slept, and then, shouting and waving their guns, they'd try to apprehend me in the dark. My showdowns with them never ended well. The massacres that you would commit without a second thought in GTA 5 punish you immensely in Red Dead, leaving you with insane bounties even after you're killed in your shootouts. The hits you take to your honor stay with you, too. The guilt stays with you. If you continue to act savagely as Arthur, a member of the gang points out that you aren't being yourself.
You look odd. You want to talk?
Arthur gets vulnerable.
I've been killing animals just for the hell of it. Also killed a bunch of innocent folk. I don't know why.
What's wrong with you, Arthur?
I just get so angry. About everything. About how this is gonna end.
It's a minor crack in the 4th wall. Nowhere near a total break. But I was shocked. I made him do these things, but I didn't expect he'd have feelings about it. That anger felt so real. I felt guilty for the way my actions as Arthur hurt other people in the game. I also felt guilty for the way my actions as the player hurt Arthur himself. Arthur contradicts everyone who gives him any sort of praise. He feels guilty.
Brother Dorkins was right about you. You are the most wonderful man.
Brother Dorkins is greatly deceived, I'm afraid, but I'm happy to help a little.
And even if you try to make him one, you know there are people you've killed you've escaped punishment for, whose deaths still stained Arthur's soul. Every good deed you do is like a desperate attempt to get him to see his own goodness, but he doesn't. And he's right. He's not a good man. So you feel guilty when he does, because you did those things together, but you're the one who's responsible. Edith Stein thought of empathy as a way of feeling alongside someone instead of for them. Stein's ideas aren't just philosophy. There's a substantial amount of neuroscience to back them up. In the early 90s, researchers in Italy discovered a special kind of brain cell called a mirror neuron. Among other functions, mirror neurons fire when we feel emotion, or when we read emotion in the tone, body, or face of another person. Video games have started using real actors to capture realistic body language and facial expressions, which only makes the emotions of their characters more convincing. Though not completely understood, researchers believe that these cells play a crucial role in both labeling what another person is feeling and feeling along with that person, making these cells important for cognitive and affective empathy. When I see Arthur regret the things he's done, I feel remorse because my mirror neurons pass a portion of his emotions onto me. When I understand that his regret is my fault, my empathy turns into guilt. It might make sense then why we can feel empathetic for characters in video games if we apply this argumentation from Stein. If we read emotion in what we see, then it doesn't matter if the person is real. You'll still feel guilty for hurting them. But before we push on to talk about Emmanual Levinas and Spec Ops The Line, we need to thank the sponsor for today's video. This video is sponsored by Delete Me. Imagine this. Everything you've worked so hard to build, gone. That's what happened to me when my channel was hacked 5 times last month. I changed my password every time and used the most advanced security features Google had to offer. But because they were able to get in once, the hackers were able to get in again and again until I successfully kicked them out for good a month later. It might have been because they had access to leaked data. If it's out there, anyone can buy your personal information on the internet. This is bad. It means you can easily be doxxed, stalked, or even lose something as important to you financially as my channel is to me. What would you do if that happened to you? Delete Me can help prevent that. Their service removes your personal information from hundreds of data broker websites where your data is being sold. I feel good knowing I'm taking action to prevent future attacks on my life. If you're afraid of the internet negatively impacting your personal life, I recommend them. With Delete Me, you can take better control of what people know about you. Get 20% off Delete Me consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Clark20 and use code Clark20 at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/Clark20, code Clark20. The exact relationship between guilt and empathy is found in the work of Emmanuel Levinas. After most of his family was murdered in the Holocaust, Levinas set out to invent a philosophy he hoped would make future genocides impossible. His book, Totality and Infinity, argues that you are personally responsible for the well-being of everyone else. Once, he was asked if this meant we're even responsible for the well-being of Nazi officers. Levinas replied that he probably wasn't the right person to ask, but his work answers in the affirmative. It's necessary to assume that we're accountable for how we treat other people because that's basically what ethics is. Levinas takes this one step further and it has massive consequences. It's a bit of a surprise how exactly, so I won't tell you just yet. We're reminded of this responsibility when we're confronted by the face of another person. Levinas doesn't mean their actual face. Instead, he means the profound vulnerability of human consciousness. The face is a living presence. It is expression, Levinas wrote. It's an encounter that, well, sounds an awful lot like Stein's description of empathy. Simply perceiving another person is a foundational part of empathy for Stein. This first act initiates a sort of discourse that allows you to better understand them and share their emotions with them from there. It reveals their humanity. But for Levinas, that discourse always comes with ethical responsibility and guilt. It's an idea represented in Spec Ops The Line's most famous scene. It's also its most gut-wrenching. Nothing comes close. The game starts with your team's comedian cracking jokes.
The local airborne insurgency has infiltrated the U.S. zone designated as my pants. Sir.
Shut up.
It was several hours later that I realized I couldn't remember the last time Lugo had tried to get a laugh. You and the 2 other members of your team have been offloading ammunition into just about anyone and everyone in a Dubai drowning in sand and eating itself alive in a confused war. Questionably armed refugees, fellow American soldiers, even the CIA. A colossal sandstorm is preventing anyone from leaving. You've made and broken alliances, and then doubled back again, until everyone is hunting you down. Nobody's on your side anymore.
You're the one who's fine,
Tensions are high.
just sitting back, waiting for things to unfuck themselves.
And then I found myself facing a blockade. A traitorous legion. Even the 3 of us, who had killed thousands of people at this point, knew we couldn't shoot our way through. So I did something unforgivable.
Fine, set it up.
You're fucking kidding, right?
That's white phosphorus.
Yeah, I know what it is.
White phosphorus is a horrifying incendiary chemical. It practically never stops burning, never stops giving off smoke and light. It burns at temperatures around 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Your bones melt at a little more than half of that. Now I was preparing to use it as a weapon.
You know
We might not have a choice, Lugo.
There's always a choice.
No, there's really not.
I remember the satisfaction I felt when I rained down an inferno of that stuff. I grew up in a household that forbade shooters during the golden era of Call of Duty. As I effortlessly incinerated the blockade from above, I thought this must have been the video game violence I missed. But Spec Ops is a different kind of game. After the dust settled, I marched through what remained of the plaza, the ghostly air still burning. Screaming soldiers with blown-off limbs crawled past me on the ground. I paused to put them out of their misery. I felt, well, of course, I felt guilty. These weren't real people, but there were still goosebumps on my arms, tension in my chest. Then you learn these soldiers were escorting innocent civilians. They were helping. None of these people deserved to die. For Levinas, the face of another person is always a reminder of our obligation to them. One basic command: don't kill me. It's the faces of these corpses that remind you these are people. Even in this state, you can see it on their faces. Fear. Because of you. At the end of the game, this mother and her child are shown with fire surrounding their heads in a halo. Their innocence, their suffering, are like that of saints.
This is your fault, goddammit!
You failed. But Walker gets it.
We need to keep moving.
What? See, Levinas' ideas on guilt are not at all what you would expect. This is the bit I said was a surprise. Levinas believed we are always guilty, a sort of original sin type situation. That's because the responsibility he assigns us is to serve every person's every need. It is an infinite task, an impossible demand we can never hope to satisfy. In Ethics and Infinity, Levinas even claims that we're responsible for how other people treat us, too. Because we can never do enough. We are infinite failures, infinitely guilty in Levinas' eyes. Somehow, that's supposed to inspire you to be a good person. This is a really extreme way of looking at moral responsibility with, I think, some dark implications. But it's relevant to Spec Ops because although Walker tells Lugo there isn't a choice, there was a chance to avoid the deaths of these innocent people. The orders Walker was given when he entered Dubai were to confirm that there were survivors and leave. There is a literal stop sign. Instead, he saddles himself with the responsibility of Levinasian proportions to save everyone. He saves no one. Do you feel like a hero yet? Standing in the tents with his victims, Walker's adamant that there was no alternative. He offloads the blame for the refugees' melting corpses onto the army. His guilt pushes him forward.
I'm gonna make these bastards pay for what they've done.
As the philosopher Slavoj Žižek has pointed out about climate activism, sometimes we like feeling guilty because it makes us feel important. That just so happens to be exactly how I describe Levinas' ideas on guilt. But in a video game, you are entirely responsible. Everything in the game is oriented around the player. If you don't give this dude medicine for a snake bite, nobody will, and that's as good as killing him yourself. Mojang's design handbook for Minecraft states that nothing happens that isn't triggered by the player. You are responsible for every disaster that happens in your world. Elements of Levinas' philosophy are foundational to a lot of game design, and that has implications for the guilt we feel. But to understand guilt in video games, we can't stop at Levinas. We have to investigate what it really means to be evil in a video game. I noticed something as I progressed through Red Dead Redemption 2. If I wanted to be a good person, I needed to treat nameless NPCs like people. But it took something other than empathy for me to go from terrorizing all of civilization to donating to churches. It took reminding me that this game cares about the kind of man Arthur Morgan is. It took the game's moral law. Games with moral systems have an inherent code for what's right and wrong, an internal law. You can see that code reflected in what the game thinks deserves a reward or a punishment. Shooting horses in the face in Red Dead punishes you with low honor. Message received: don't kill horses. That's evil. Most games like this use what appears like a Kantian moral framework. In his book, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, Immanuel Kant sought to discover an objective standard for how human beings should act. To be truly objective, it has to be universal, meaning it has to be true for everyone, everywhere, all of the time. And that extends to the reason you have for doing something too. Kant believed the only good reason to do the right thing is because you have a duty to. He disagreed with the idea that it's the consequences of your actions that make them ethical. That isn't the basis for a universal standard because the same action can have different consequences in different circumstances. There are moments in Red Dead Redemption 2 when you can decline a reward for helping someone. Doing so raises your honor.
The game likes it when you do this. That tired cliche we've all heard of, "I did it because it was right," is exactly what Kant was so enamored with.
The only praiseworthy reason to be a good person is for its own sake. You can, because you must. When World War II ended, an important Nazi official by the name of Adolf Eichmann escaped from Germany to Argentina using a fake passport provided to him by a Catholic priest. Eichmann's nickname was the architect of the final solution to the Jewish question. He was the man responsible for orchestrating the Holocaust. He never killed any Jews himself, but he drafted and signed the paperwork that murdered millions. Edith Stein was one of the passengers on Eichmann's trains. In 1960, the same year Levinas was writing Totality and Infinity, Aishman was kidnapped in Argentina by Israeli special forces. His trial in Jerusalem would produce a book whose controversy is still felt today. Aishman in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil by Hannah Arendt. Arendt attended this trial with heightened anticipation. She was Jewish herself and had escaped the Holocaust. The trial would be her only chance to see such an evil man in the flesh. But whatever she had imagined, Eichmann wasn't it. He seemed entirely normal, an even boring kind of person. For designing the system that slaughtered an estimated 30 to 35 million people, Eichmann was accused of crimes against humanity and the Jewish people. In his defense, he insisted that he'd only been following orders. It was nothing personal. He left no doubt that he would have killed his own father if he had received an order to that effect. He even went so far as to claim that he had been using Kant's universal law during his execution of the Holocaust. This shocked the court. He had no choice, Eichmann said. He was obligated to fulfill his duty.
Anklagepunkt schuldig oder nicht schuldig?
Im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig.
Eichmann's misuse of Kant's philosophy is addressed in Kant's own writings. What is Kant's universal law?
Only act in such a way that you can will that your maxim should be a universal moral law. In other words, if you can say that everyone, everywhere, all of the time should do what you're doing, your action is ethical. Universality takes center stage here. The law is only ethical when it's universal. Killing civilians is never excusable, so why should you get away with it when you do it? Kant believed that since rational beings have a duty to do what's right, they also have to be free to make the right choice. And part of that freedom means using your own ability to reason to figure out how you should act. He calls the moral will self-legislating. Because the moral law is universal, everyone should always arrive at the same conclusion when they think rationally. And an important point he makes is that if someone else told you what to do, then you couldn't guarantee you were doing what's right out of duty to the universal law. Your duty would be displaced because it would come from outside of you, and that has no moral worth to Kant. You need to be able to find and fulfill your duty on your own to be a good person. You need to have a choice.
There's always a choice. No, there's really not.
In contrast to Spec Ops The Line, Baldur's Gate 3 is a game that prides itself on your ability to choose. If you told me you haven't heard someone say, "I can't believe the game let me do that," I wouldn't believe you. And those choices aren't frivolous either. The game boasts 17,000 ending variations. One of the game's origin characters is a psychopath. Okay, maybe more than one, but I really mean it for this one.
My rancid blood whispers to me, kill, kill, and kill again.
But most of the time, even when the voices are so strong they require a skill check to resist them, Baldur's Gate 3 is very forgiving about letting you get your way. There's no real obligation to be evil. But there's one scene where you don't get a choice. It's the only one. In the opening act of the game, there's a group of refugees seeking asylum in the sacred grove of some druids. One of these refugees, a fan favorite, is especially inspired by your heroics and asks to spend the night in your camp with you and your friends. You'll dream that night about brutally murdering her, only to awaken and find yourself standing over her broken, blood-soaked body, mouth agape, blood so thick on her freshly scarred face it seals her eyes shut as if you had sewn her eyelids together. There are no dice rolls, no dialogue options, no ways to avoid her murder. You have no choice. The horror isn't without its reward, though. Her murder summons your evil butler, who rewards you with a special cloak, and he promises other rewards every time you do similarly horrendous things. It might make her death worth it, as long as you weren't attached to her. I began to have fun being evil. The incentives of unique content and powerful items got me to act against my moral interests. That sort of encouragement other games give you when they want you to do something led me to believe this character was meant to be evil. The game quickly confronted me about my poor choices.
These dead need not be buried. Beneath this canopy of darkness, all is 1 yard of restless graves.
I felt guilty again. I realized the game didn't have an internal law to tell me what was right and wrong. I had to decide on my own what choices I should make. That's more Kantian than games like Mass Effect 2, Fallout 3, or even Red Dead, all of which tell you what's moral from the start. Later in Spec Ops, there were other scenes where the game led me to believe I had no choice other than to be a monster. After a helicopter crash, you get separated from Lugo, who breaks his leg. As I shot through the waves of soldiers separating us, he began to scream for help on the radio. The enemies couldn't seem to die fast enough. Getting closer now, I sprinted through a labyrinth of tents. I turned the final corner, but I was too late. The locals had him dangling in the air with his neck in a noose. I fired everything I had into the crowd. I was unaware that I had a choice this time. You can make these people pay for what they did to Lugo, or scare them off by shooting into the sky. That isn't what I did. I was so convinced that I had to be violent to play this game the way it was intended to be that I didn't even consider it. I felt guilty later when I learned I could have done something different. In Cyberpunk 2077, when I played through the mission that gives you the opportunity to crucify someone, I kept asking myself, why am I being allowed to do this? But even those questions didn't stop me. I grimaced as the nails and hammer met. The game requires you to strike each nail several times. It's not pretty. My victim screamed as the nail sunk deeper into his flesh. Keanu Reeves quoted the Bible.
The Messiah, save yourself and save us.
I told myself I didn't want to be doing this. I hated it. But, and here's that same phrase again, the game needed me to. These are moments I've never forgotten. They're the kind of moments in a game you have dreams about. My guilt made them feel so real to me. Kant argues that guilt is precisely what solidifies our freedom as an existential fact. I felt guilty because I felt responsible for acting against my moral interests, even though I strongly believed I had to in order to progress. Zizek once said about Kant that duty itself can't serve as an excuse for doing one's duty. If one expects Kant's law of universality to tell them what to do, one has already failed. As countless other writers have claimed, just about anything can be turned into a universal law. Kant is missing something. He starts off his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals by claiming that a good will is the only thing that can't be corrupted. But what's considered good, or how we'll know what actions everyone should do, is never stated. His logic collapses into a circle. Kant tells us nothing about what our duty is, only that we have a duty. Zizek claims this is actually the greatest strength of Kant's ethics. We can never use the law as a crutch for our decisions. We bear full responsibility for our actions and the principles we follow. Insofar as this is the case, the moral law is there to judge us more than save us. Kant writes that the moral law only manifests itself as the guilt we feel from violating it. In a presentation given by Walt Williams, the writer of Spec Ops The Line, he makes a point that fascinated me as an admirer of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. It's his fourth point: let the players judge themselves. In Chapter 4 of the story, your teammates get pinned down under heavy fire, and you have to rush through a passage to get a different vantage point. An unarmed woman tries to run past you, and more often than not, players mistake her for an enemy and shoot her. Nobody in the game sees this, and nothing happens if you do, but you still feel guilty. Why? Williams' take is that guilt is a form of anticipation. Lacan wrote the most about desire. His most famous one-liner is that man's desire is the desire of the other. It means that we care so much about whether or not we're desirable to other people that our own desires work in a way we hope will make us lovable. I've talked about this idea a lot in my videos. Every desire is a response to the question, what do you want from me? That question is the source of what Lacan calls anxiety. It's a question that preoccupied him for his entire career. The feeling of anxiety and the question that inspires it, I believe, intersect quite well with guilt. The truth behind the idea that you can let the players judge themselves is that it's never the players who judge themselves. If guilt is a form of anticipation, then it anticipates an answer to the question of what you are. Your teammates in Spec Ops act as the voice of reason. In Baldur's Gate 3, your victims and friends will implore you for a reason for your atrocities.
Around you, I'm not who I want to be.
They speak for the developers in condemning your evil acts. Their voices add to your guilt. How a game understands and treats evil sets the conditions for our guilt. We don't only feel guilty for the choices we make because of their consequences. Guilt also stems from how our choices resonate with us emotionally, how they shape the kind of person we think we are. The guilt we feel is decided by empathy and where our duty lies. At the end of the day, these are just games. The choices we make in them don't determine how moral of a person we are, but the guilt we feel can teach us something about our own lives. Arthur Morgan's guilt and hopeless frustration seeped into my own life as I accompanied him on his journey towards redemption. Things I felt guilty about for years returned, things I was angry at myself for, and one day, I just started crying. Others before me have shared how Red Dead Redemption 2 makes you want to be a better person in your own life. As I continued to play, I felt that same way. I messaged the people I felt indebted to. I apologized to my younger brother for not being there for him when he needed me. I thanked my dad for being a positive role model. Things I wanted to say for years but never had. Once more, I began to cry. Happy tears this time. Empathy may not be perfect, but it's powerful. When it's married to universal truth, we allow ourselves the freedom to change, to escape an otherwise infinite guilt. My desire to be a better person was inspired by a fictional world with fictional people, but one that dared to challenge me morally and ask, who are you? Who do you want to become? Thanks again, Delete Me, for sponsoring this video. To get your data removed from the internet, check out Delete Me using the link in the description and get 20% off.